Welcome back, guys. Today we're working on a project that's very near and dear to my heart. This is actually a computer that I owned 20 years ago, and I gave it away to a family member when I upgraded to something a little bit better, and it recently made its way back to me. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how that happened a bit later in the video, but what we're looking at here is a Pentium 1 laptop from 1997. This is a Pentium 233 megahertz MMX. And I bought this laptop in 2001, roughly, so it had been out for a number of years when I picked it up. And as you can tell by the funky keyboard, it's a Japanese import. It's a very unique design. It's got a completely modular floppy CD-ROM and hard disk drive, and it no longer has the battery, but it supported dual batteries, and the battery would have gone in to replace either the floppy drive or the CD-ROM drive. This laptop would have been state-of-the-art in 1997. Based on the information that I've been able to dig up, it would have cost $6,000 when it was new, and that's almost $10,000 adjusted for inflation. Now, when you start it up, it's clear that the CMOS battery is dead. It displays the same error messages every time it's started up, and it looks like the hard drive might be dead as well. When you go into the BIOS under primary master, it says none, even though it's set to auto, but it never actually detects a hard disk. And that's not unusual for a system that's coming up on 25 years. Parts of the housing are also a little bit loose, but thankfully none of the screws are missing. So we're going to open the system up, see what we can do about that CMOS battery, give it a new hard disk, and refurbish it and try and set it up the way it would have been set up when it was new in 1997. This particular model would have originally shipped with Windows NT 4, but there was a consumer version that would have shipped with Windows 95. I think most people in this situation would probably install Windows 98 or 98 SE on a laptop like this. It can probably comfortably handle Windows ME or 2000 as well, but I think I would rather recreate that experience that someone would have had owning a laptop like this the year that it was released. Now, you're not going to find a lot of information about this laptop online, let alone a teardown guide, so I'm kind of winging it here with the teardown, just taking screws out and gently prying the case apart bit by bit until everything comes apart. And what I found on the keyboard ribbon cable is perhaps one of the most bizarre things that I've ever seen inside a system, be it a laptop or a game console. There was a paper clip just clipped on to the keyboard ribbon cable, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why this would be here. Later, when I test the system out, the keyboard completely checks out, so I'm not sure what that paper clip would have been doing in there in terms of serving any practical purpose. At this point, all the screws on the bottom case are off, and I'm just working my way down on the top case until I can finally separate the two halves and expose the motherboard. Removing these three screws on the screen bezel turned out to be completely unnecessary, but I figured that out after I separated the screen from the mainboard. Working on video game consoles, you always find a teardown guide or a video of someone having done a teardown on the console before you, so going into a project like this is another challenge altogether. You really are just going in blind, prying the case open, trying to separate it, and just seeing where it's still holding itself together, and just continuing to take screws off until things start coming apart. Taking my first look inside, I can see where the CMOS battery is, and no, unfortunately it's not a CR2025. Those coin cell batteries were not at all common in laptops of this time period. We have two batteries in here, strangely. I've also never seen something like that before. Usually there's just one system battery. And looking at the corners of these, you can see the white residue that a leaking battery would have left behind. People typically confuse this for battery acid, but it's actually an alkaline residue, and you neutralize it using a mild acid like vinegar, which is something we're going to do a little bit later. The internal design of this laptop is so elegant for something that's 25 years old. They've managed to cram so much in what would have been a fairly small package for a desktop replacement laptop or an enterprise laptop like this one. And I don't have to do a full teardown if my only goal is to swap out the system battery, but there's two reasons I want to completely tear this laptop down. The first is to clean it, and while it's not particularly dirty, I do want to give it a thorough cleaning while I'm in here, just so I don't have to open it up again. And the second is so that I can look at all the chipsets and get their model numbers. And that's going to be extremely helpful when we're hunting down drivers later. While an operating system like Windows 98 SE might detect a lot of the hardware on this laptop, it might not, but Windows 95 certainly won't. And one of the biggest challenges with restoring old laptops like this is finding the right drivers. And knowing the chipsets that are in here is going to be extremely helpful in helping me hunt down some reference drivers that will get this thing working with Windows 95. Looking at these two batteries, one of them's labeled at 3.6 volts and one of them's labeled at 7.2 volts. Both batteries are dead. These batteries are obviously proprietary, but you can refurbish almost any battery if you break it down to its individual cells. So that's the approach that I'm going to take here. And there we have it right there. Probably should have been wearing gloves for this part. My fingers did start kind of burning a little, and I cleaned up and washed my hands right away, so probably not a good idea to handle this stuff with your bare hands. All that I need to really salvage from this setup are the connectors, and at least one of them is caked in a little bit of corrosion, so I'm going to give them both a vinegar bath. So after removing both the connectors from the dead batteries, they just soak in this little vinegar container for about 30 minutes. And if you look closely, you can actually see how the acid in the vinegar kind of bubbles away the residue that is formed on those connectors. And they cleaned up really well. So I didn't find a 3.6 volt or 7.2 volt version of this battery, but I found a 12 volt version on a website called batteriesinaflash.com. This cost me about $25. They're made with the exact same cells that the pair of batteries I have are made from. And this battery is made in Germany. It's not a cheap Chinese battery, so I think if I can get it working, it's gonna last another 20 years in this laptop. The orientation of the cells in this battery pack is different from the original. Here, they're all stacked on top of each other, whereas the batteries in the laptop are welded together flat, sitting side by side. I think I'm going to have enough clearance to sit this battery in, but if I don't, I always have the option of separating all the cells and just arranging them in the same configuration as the original. I have 10 cells here, and they're 1.2 volts each. So I need to break off 3 cells to make a 3.6 volt battery and 6 cells to make a 7.2 volt battery. That'll leave me with 1 spare cell. With an individual cell voltage of 1.2 volts, my 3-pack should read 3.6, and my 6-pack should read 7.2. And I'm getting the right voltages on both these packs here. To kind of show you how these battery packs are built, here you can see how it basically sits in a welding cup that is welded onto the top of the battery underneath. And that's how they're stacked one on top of the other to get the required voltage for your application. I have a terminal on either end of the two battery packs that I broke off, so all I'm doing here is sanding a small area on the other end so that the solder has something to bite onto when we solder the cable connector in place. This is the largest shrink tubing that I have, but unfortunately it's a little bit too small to slide onto the battery pack, so I'm just going to use some electrical tape later. It's too bad, I think it would have looked really professional with the heat shrink tubing, but the electrical tape should serve the same practical purpose. The jaws on my helping hands were a little bit too small to hold this battery down for me while I was soldering the wires on, so I ended up just using a dumbbell to weigh it down so it wouldn't move until I got the wires soldered on there. My flux has been giving me a bit of trouble over the last couple of repairs, and I'm having to apply quite a bit of force to get it to deposit some flux sometimes. So I don't know if it's beginning to crystallize. I've never had problems with this flux. I don't recall ever forgetting to cover the syringe when I store it, so I'm not sure what's happening here, but even though I've been raving about this flux for a long while now, I placed an order for my first batch of Amtech 559, and I'm going to try a different flux moving forward. So that takes care of the smaller 3.6 volt battery, and here I'm just repeating the same process for the larger 7.2 volt battery. Alright, looking good. Now to test them both out, I probe the larger battery with my multimeter and I get 6.1 volts, which I find a little bit odd. It's supposed to be 7.2 volts. And I'm thinking maybe the temperature from the iron has somehow degraded the battery, but it just doesn't make sense. So I'm kind of scratching my head about that as I check the other battery, which is reading 3.6 volts as it should. Now, going back to the 7.2 volt battery, I start measuring the cells one by one, and I get 1.2 volts across each cell, except the very last one. It's reading 0 volts. It's almost like it's a dead short. I take a closer look at the battery and I notice that I've actually shorted the positive and negative terminals on that top battery when I soldered on the negative wire. So I quickly undo my work and I measure the voltage across it and it's reading less than half a volt. And I'm thinking, oh God, I've damaged this cell. I'm not completely panicked yet because I know I have a spare cell to work with. But I give it a couple of minutes and I go back and measure it and the voltage has recovered to over 1.1 volts. So I think I'm in the clear here, but that could have been a lot worse had I not checked my work and noticed it right away. Much better. Now we're getting 7.2 volts, so this pack is good to go. All done. We'll get back to these during the reassembly. Here I have the daughter board that has the Pentium CPU, and I'm going to remove this heatsink and see what the thermal paste situation looks like underneath. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was no thermal compound at all on a CPU of this era, but it looks like there's a small thermal pad on the CPU die, and measuring it with a caliper, it looks like it's about 0.6 millimeters. I have some thermal pads from Arctic. This is by the same company that makes Arctic MX4. And I've used these on a couple of projects. The iMac repair, I've used them on the GameCube restoration. They work really well and they come in a bunch of different sizes. Here, since I measured 0.6, I'm just going to round up and use 1 millimeter pads. And it has a little bit of give, so once the CPU heatsink is clamped down, it should compress the pad a little bit. I know someone's going to ask me about these fingerprints, and believe you me, I scrubbed them silly, but they would not come off. I think they're left over from the manufacturing process. So this is as clean as I could get it. As for the system batteries, they sat in the cavity where the old batteries were, and they actually fit pretty well, but they were just a little bit proud where this plastic lid would no longer click on properly. I probably could have forced it shut, but it wouldn't have been 100% flat. And I realized when the CD-ROM drive was in, the cavity was designed in a way where it would sit right underneath the side of the CD-ROM. So there was nowhere for it to go, and I was confident that once everything was put together, these batteries weren't going to be moving around. So I just left them as is. And just confirming that they're both delivering power to the board, the small battery is indeed delivering 3.6 volts, and the large battery is delivering 7.2 volts, or thereabouts. So in terms of how I was reunited with this lovely machine, like I mentioned, I gifted this to a family member, a cousin when I was a teenager. I always had stuff like this when I was younger, and I just buy them and fix them up, and I'd always upgrade, and it was just such a big part of my life. And I often gifted friends and family technology gifts. So I was visiting a cousin one summer, and I showed up with this laptop, and they only had a desktop at home, so this became his computer, and he used it for school, and I think he used it for a number of years, and that's the last I saw of it. Now, fast forward 15, 20 years, I'm doing this sort of stuff on YouTube now and just having fun with these console restorations and these tech repairs. So I was catching up with this guy, and he'd seen a couple of my videos, and we got to talking about video games and the consoles we grew up with, and he's like, dude, do you remember that laptop you gave me? I think I still have it. I'm gonna look for it. I'm gonna send it to you. And I was like, are you serious? Wow. Yes, please. If you find it, please send it to me. I would love to restore that thing. And here we are. We're on the home stretch here. Last thing to do is swap out the dead hard drive. I have several of these new old stock 20 gig IDE drives, and that's going to be perfect for this project. You actually can install SSDs in machines like this. If you're interested in doing something like that, check out my iBook G3 restoration video. They actually work very well, and they're not that expensive either. We need to set the drive as master, so following the jumper diagram here, we're going to remove the jumper to make sure the drive is set as master. And with that, we are done. I would love to show you guys how I initialized this machine and set everything up step by step, but that would be a whole video in and of itself. So if you guys want to know how you would set up DOS or Windows 95 on a machine of this generation, I've added a couple of useful links in the video description. Once Windows 95 was successfully installed, there were so many missing drivers. No sound, no graphics driver, no network card, no USB, nothing. But because we had taken the trouble to carefully tear the machine down and look at all those chipsets, despite the fact that there's close to no documentation on this machine, I was able to find every single Windows 95 driver and get this laptop working 100%. Despite the hours and hours that I put into hunting down all the right drivers for this machine, it was well worth it in the end. I'm so glad that I was able to get Windows 95 working and not have to install a newer operating system. And not a lot of people can say that they have USB working with Windows 95. In fact, USB support wasn't included in Windows 95 until 1997, and it actually works quite well. So why am I so excited about this machine? I've wanted to build a DOS gaming machine for a while, and when the opportunity to get this laptop came about, I realized that I can do everything I want to do from a gaming perspective on a machine like this. Yes, it's a Pentium 1, it's not a 486, and it might be a little bit fast for some 80s DOS games, but even on a machine like this, there are ways to slow the processor down and get a really good experience playing those older DOS titles. But if nothing else, now I have a laptop that can play DOS games natively. It has a floppy disk drive that works, it's got a CD-ROM that works, it has the convenience of USB, which is almost unheard of for a computer of this generation. Now, you'll notice when I start the game, it's centered in the middle of the screen. The 640 by 480 resolution isn't stretched across this 1024 by 768 display. And this is actually one of the main reasons why older laptops with a 640 by 480 resolution are very sought after. Because a lot of these older machines don't give you a way to enable screen stretching in the BIOS or through a configuration utility or something like that. But there's actually a video expansion utility that you guys see me running right here that will enable screen stretching on almost any laptop of this generation, and this is something we used to do all the time back in the day. It took me a long time to find this utility. I had to use the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive just to find a working download, but I found it eventually. I've also linked it in the video description in case someone out there might find it helpful. I am so excited to start building out my DOS gaming library, guys. Right now, I only have a handful of games on floppy disk, but I have a bunch of DOS games on CD, and that's something to keep in mind as well. DOS games were still coming out on CD through the late 90s, and you'll find games that may have originally been released on floppy disk later released on CD-ROM, and they're often a lot easier to find, and they're a lot cheaper as well. Quite honestly, the only thing I think this laptop needs is an external mouse. It's a little bit awkward with a touchpad, but other than that, I can't think of anything that would make this setup any better or more convenient. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I had a lot of fun with this one, and parts of it were hard. Hunting down those battery cells and installing the drivers, that took such a long time, but it was well worth it in the end, and I'm glad I have a machine that I can do some native DOS gaming on and just enjoy Windows 95 and some older software. I'm going to leave you guys with the only 2 photos I was able to find with this laptop in it from 15-20 years ago. I think these photos were taken around 2003 with the laptop in the background. I don't know how you guys feel looking at 15-20-year-old photos of yourself, but these were pretty hilarious, that's for sure. Take care, guys. See you again soon.